In several recent episodes of Booknotes Plus, we have featured books from the World War II era. An important figure from that time has been mentioned but not discussed during any of those interviews. Her name is Elizabeth Bentley. She was the first person to reveal to the FBI and the Congress the names of people living in the United States and spying for the Soviets, both Americans and foreign-born operatives. In order to better understand this former communist spy turned informant, we asked Kathryn Olmsted, author of Red Spy Queen, a biography of Elizabeth Bentley, to tell us the late spy's story. Kathryn Olmsted, in your book, Red Spy Queen, I want to read you just a couple of sentences and get you to fill in the blanks. A large-boned, self-confident brunette with a sharp nose and receding chin, she was called a spy queen, an old biddy, a beautiful young blonde, and a neurotic old maid. Her critics spread rumors of her promiscuity, her abortions, her bisexual tendencies, and her alcoholism. I could go on, but I'll get you to explain all that.
All right. Well, that's a description of Elizabeth Bentley, who was an American woman who spied for the Soviet Union from 1938 to 1945. And she was a very significant spy. And then she was an even more significant defector. And what I found interesting about her is that most people have never heard of her. And part of the reason for that is what you just read, is that she was caricatured in the press as her defenders wanted her to be a Mata Hari. They believed that it helped her charges that she was an actual Soviet spy if she was somehow young and blonde and beautiful and had slept with her sources. So they described her as the blonde spy queen. Her detractors called her a man-hating spinster who could not get a man and so therefore made up these espionage charges against men. And she herself then portrayed herself as this idealistic woman who had been manipulated by men, in part to escape the consequences for her actions. So there were all these dueling images of Elizabeth Bentley in the press. And while she was quite well known at the time, these various stereotypes, the tropes that were used to describe her, have made it so that people tended not to believe the substance of what she said and what she did. And she has been largely lost to history.
As you well know, this is not a new book. And one of the nice things about this is that the University of North Carolina Press prints it up on demand. So we were able to get a copy of it. But we wanted to talk to you about Elizabeth Bentley and start with where was she from?
She was from a place called New Milford, Connecticut. She was from a small town. Her father was a department store manager, so she was middle class, Republican, Episcopalian background. She was an only child, and she had a long New England lineage, perhaps not as distinguished as she later claimed. She said she had an ancestor who signed the Declaration of Independence, came over on the Mayflower. That is possibly not true, but certainly she was from a very old Protestant white New England family.
How long did she spend in Florence after she got her Vassar degree?
Just a year. She was getting a master's in Italian at Columbia.
And what did that over there? I mean, there's so many times it's referenced in your book about committing suicide.
Yeah.
How often does that come up in the book?
Well, she thought about it a lot. Of course, as a historian, you don't want to do too much armchair psychoanalysis, but it does seem that she was possibly bipolar. She liked to have a lot of fun when she was in a good mood, and then she would have these long periods where she said she just felt blue and just wanted to sleep all day for weeks. She also was an alcoholic throughout most of her adult life.
Did she ever marry?
She never married. No, she did live with her Soviet controller, her supervisor, for about 5 years.
How did she get into being a communist spy?
Well, I think you have to break that down into, first of all, how did she become a communist? And then how did she become a spy? Because the vast majority of American communists, of course, were never spies. But she became a communist in 1934. The depths of the Great Depression. She was in New York City, which had the largest population of American communists at that time. And as far as most communists who joined the party at the time believed, the capitalism had failed. And they looked around and they saw all of these people who were unemployed and people who were hungry, yet the crops were rotting in the fields. And they believed, based on the controlled press out of the Soviet Union, that communism was a better way forward. So she was she wasn't a real intellectual. It wasn't like she read Marx and said, oh, that makes sense. But she just had this general feeling that the communists were for social justice and she was for social justice. And also she had friends who were in the party at the time. So she just sort of drifted into the party, which was not, the party was at its peak popularity at that time. So it wasn't unheard of. But what was unusual is that then, when she was a communist, she decided she also wanted to find out how to become a communist spy. And so she essentially volunteered her services. She went to the headquarters of the American Communist Party and suggested, first of all, that she could spy on Italian fascists, since she had been in Italy and she said she had been an anti-fascist, but actually she had been a fascist and an anti-fascist in Italy. And so she got a job at an Italian fascist propaganda agency in New York and started to try and gather gossip and documents for the communists about the fascists. And then she was eventually turned over to the KGB, who began training her to be a courier and then a case officer. She was a perfect candidate to be a Soviet spy because nobody would suspect her, because she was a woman, also because she was from this Protestant New England background, which was not at all the stereotype that most Americans had about communists at the time.
We'll come back to this, of course, but I want to ask you some questions about yourself. Where do you live?
I live in Davis, California.
What's your full-time work?
I'm a history professor at the University of California, Davis.
What do you teach?
U.S. history, 20th century mostly.
And where are you from originally?
I'm from San Bernardino, California.
And how did you get into this? I know you've done several books on this kind of stuff. How did you get into it?
Well, this was my second book. My first one was on the investigations of the CIA and FBI after Watergate. The best known of these investigations is the Church Committee from the mid-1970s. So I was interested broadly in intelligence history. And after the end of the Cold War, the fall of the Soviet Union, a lot of documents started coming out about Soviet espionage in America. And I was intrigued by the women who had spied for the Soviet Union. And so I started to think, this was by now in the late 90s, well, I'll write a book about American women who spied for the Soviets. And then as I continued my research, Bentley just started taking over the book because she was so much more significant than any of the other women. She had spied for many years. She had been a case officer for many different agents, and then she had been such a significant defector. And she had been ignored and dismissed for so many years that when the documents started coming out of the former Soviet Union to show that she had been telling the truth, at least most of the time, at least at the beginning, I thought, well, this really revises our understanding of the origins of the spy scare, of the second Red Scare.
Here's a couple of lines from your book, just to put her in context with this story. In the winter of 1950, the nation's headlines told of Klaus Fuchs' confession, Alger Hiss's perjury conviction, and Senator Joseph McCarthy's charges that there were 205 card-carrying members of the Communist Party in the State Department. But the woman who had prompted all of the charges and countercharges was unemployed, depressed, and broke. How did she expose all of that before, and then why was she broke?
Well, she exposed it. First of all, she defected in 1945. This is right as the war is ending. Remember, of course, the Soviets and the Americans were allied during the war. And as the war ended, she was worried that spying for the Soviet Union would be seen much differently after the end of the war than it had been, might have been during the war, that she would now be seen as spying for an enemy rather than an ally. She was also increasingly worried that the KGB was trying to kill her, that she had become unreliable. And we know from the Soviet archives that, in fact, they were considering killing her. And she was worried that the FBI was about to arrest her. So she, which it wasn't, actually, it did not know about her. But because she was concerned about arrest, about execution, about possibly being tried for being a traitor, she decided to go to the FBI. She defected. She told the FBI about everything she had done, everyone who had worked with her, in the hopes that this would then give her immunity from prosecution. And this was in 1945, but actually the public did not know about this for 3 years. She was used by the FBI as a double agent for 3 years. So she secretly went out into the field and pretended to still be a spy in order to catch other spies. But it turned out they knew about this, so all of the Soviet spies in America had been warned, and nobody would cooperate with her. And in 1948, the Justice Department was starting to have trials of American communist leaders, the Smith Act trials, and Bentley decided that she was going to take her story public, in part because she thought she would make a lot of money. She would be an ex-communist who could sell her autobiography, and then she would be the Red Spy Queen. So she went to the newspapers with her story, then testified before Congress, and started to be used in some of the trials against accused communists at the time. So she decided essentially to be a professional witness. But it did not turn out the way that she had hoped at all. She felt guilty about turning on her earlier, or on her friends who had been communist, her sources, and she did not make the kind of money that she had hoped. And she began to get lonelier and more depressed, and couldn't get a job, and began to drink more and more.
How much? I mean, it happens to be on so many pages. I wanted to ask you to put it in perspective. How much drinking did she do?
Oh, so much. And this is what comes across in all of the documents from the FBI, from the KGB, from all of the contemporary testimony we have at the time, is that she really was a very serious alcoholic. Probably from college on, but definitely after her defection, when she got more and more depressed.
How much did either the FBI, after she turned, or the communists before that, how much concern did they have about her drinking?
Well, the communists had, especially at the end of her relationship with the KGB, they were very worried, which is why they started talking about killing her, because it's not a very reliable thing, of course, to have one of your spies be drunk all the time. And in particular, in the last couple of meetings she had with her Soviet controllers, she showed up drunk and made wild accusations. And so that's when he started wiring back to Moscow and saying, we should consider getting rid of her because she's a security risk. So they were very worried. The FBI also was worried because she was an essential witness for them. Also, she was serving their political purposes. They were very much hoping that she could go out there and be the face of ex-communism and show the dangers of communism. And they did not want her to ruin her own credibility. And so there's a lot in the FBI memos, the internal FBI memos, about how worried they are about her drinking.
How did you go about your research on this, and what years did you actually research?
Well, I started researching this in the late 90s, and the book came out about 25 years ago. I did a lot of my research at that time in the FBI reading room. Much of this material is now available online, but at the time I had to go to the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C. That's where I did most of it. Then I tried to find people who had known her, and I interviewed them on the phone, including some of the FBI agents who had been assigned to her. The Russians had opened up their archives, but not to everyone. They only let a few select people in, but I was able to get a hold of some of the original documents that one of those historians had seen. So his notes on those documents. So I put all of that together, as well as, of course, government hearings and government reports.
Let me go back to your FBI department visit. How do you do that?
Well, it was back then. It was quite an experience for a researcher. You would write ahead and make a reservation, and then you would go to the J. Edgar Hoover building in Washington, D.C., and go through all kinds of metal detectors and be assigned a minder. And then they would take you to a room where they had all of the historic FBI files. And they would select some for you. If you were looking at somebody like Bentley, who other people had looked at before, they would be very accessible. And so I could just go into the shelves myself and pick out the files and go and sit down and take notes. Back then, I didn't have an iPhone, so took all the notes by hand.
How much was there?
Well, what the FBI saved was there. So what I saw was from the FBI's perspective. There wasn't a lot from the earlier period, because except for a brief period in 1941, she was not on their radar. But then once she defected in 1945, there was a tremendous amount. So hundreds and hundreds of pages of documents of her confession, and then of their investigations of the various people that she had named.
You know, a lot of people I've interviewed talk about the Venona papers, but I need your help in explaining where they are, how do you get to them, and how significant are they?
Well, now I believe they're all online. At the time that I was researching, they were available, that you could get them in printed form. They are the decoded Soviet cables, or partially decoded Soviet cables, from mostly from the World War II era. The Soviets were sending coded cables back and forth as part of their communication system. Obviously, they didn't want to talk on the phone, and it took a long time to send documents via diplomatic pouch. So they would send urgent messages by telegram in code, and after the code breaking agency in the Army couldn't read them at the time, couldn't decode them, but saved all of the telegrams. And then after the war, they made a breakthrough and started to partially decode them. And it was these telegrams, these secret partially decoded telegrams, that we call the Venona Project. They were not known to the American public at the time, and really not until the 1990s did most people know about them and where they released. But these Venona cables, these partially decoded and translated Soviet cables from the 1940s have served as important pieces of evidence in determining the extent of Soviet espionage in the United States during World War II.
Who controls those papers today?
Well, I believe they're part of the NSA now. The NSA wasn't created at that time, but now they're under the purview of the NSA.
If you want to go there somewhere to look at them instead of doing it online, is there a place to go?
That I don't know. I have not done research at the NSA.
Have you used Venona papers in any other of your books?
No, just that one.
The book that she wrote, how significant was that for you in your research?
Well, it was a source. She wrote an autobiography. It was called Out of Bondage. She wrote it to get money and to justify her life. And she hoped to become a professional lecturer. At that time, that was a path available to ex-communists. If you had quite the story, then a lot of conservative groups would pay you a lot of money to come talk about the evils of communism. So she described communism as bondage. So the title was Out of Bondage. And she talked about her early life and how she became a communist and how she became a spy. And then the first couple years after her defection. She didn't write much of it. I think she wrote a rough draft, but she had a ghostwriter. And it's clearly her life as she would have liked it to be. So I had to compare her own story to other sources to make a determination of how accurate it was or how much I could use it. And in some cases, there were diametrically opposed versions of what had happened in a certain situation. Also, she portrayed herself as this naive schoolgirl who had been drawn into this evil conspiracy. And I think overall, that was not at all true. She definitely made her own decisions as she went through life.
Who is Mr. Golos?
So Golos was the name of her Soviet supervisor and lover. They met in 1938. He was an American Communist member. He was from the Soviet Union, or from pre-Soviet Russia, from Ukraine, I believe. And he had immigrated to the United States, become a Communist Party member, had been very excited when the Bolsheviks took over in the Soviet Union, and had become a very important member of the Communist Party of the USA. He was on what was called the Control Commission that was looking for Trotskyists and expelling them from the party. And then he was also an agent for what we now know as the KGB. And so when Elizabeth Bentley decided that she wanted to be a Soviet spy and had volunteered herself to the American communists, they turned her over to Golos because he was one of the most important Soviet agents in the United States. So he was her trainer, her mentor, her case officer. And at first, he was training her to be his courier to his other agents. They fell in love. She moved in with him. He was quite a bit older than she was, but she always said that he was the only man that she ever loved. She had lots of boyfriends, but this was her only long-term relationship. And his health started to deteriorate. He was just in his mid-40s, but his heart was not good. And so by the time World War II had started for the United States, he was staying home more and more and sending her out to meet his sources. And so that she was his courier, then his assistant, and she was basically running his network by the time he died in 1943.
How much information did the Soviets get back in those days from these spies?
Well,
and how significant was it?
That is a really interesting question that we can partially answer because we have now the Venona papers and we have the Soviet archives. they were able to get a lot of information about wartime production, like how many airplanes were being made. They were able to get some early plans for new military technology. They were able to get gossip from the White House or the State Department about who in the Roosevelt administration was pro-Soviet, who was anti-Soviet. That's the kind of thing that we know they were able to get. Now, Bentley later claimed that there were, much more important things that she was able to, information that she was able to steal. But that is a lot more debatable, especially the policy consequences. She later claimed that some of her sources had been able to influence American foreign policy, and that is very questionable. Now, she was not involved at all with the atomic spying. There was a separate spy ring that was able to get some important information about the atomic bomb, largely from Klaus Fuchs, who you mentioned earlier, who was a British scientist at Los Alamos.
How would she pick up the information, and how would she get it to the Soviet Union?
Well, some of her sources were in industry, and they were in New York, because remember, the Soviet Union had a controlled economy, so they were interested in all kinds of things that were just as far as like industrial processes. So those she got from people in New York. Many of her sources were in Washington, D.C. They were mostly mid-level bureaucrats in agencies like the War Production Board. And she would go down to Washington, D.C. every 2 weeks, and she would meet with her sources, and they would either brief her orally, or they would give her documents, or in one case where she had, there was an economist who helped her a lot, who had sources of his own. There were so many documents that they started photographing them, and they would put them on film, on microfilm, and she would put them in her knitting bag and then take the train back to New York, where she would hand them off to the Soviets. They would put them in a diplomatic pouch to send them to Moscow. So, and she was a good spy in part because she was a woman, because she was a rather plain looking woman who you wouldn't turn around and look at. So as a result, she was never questioned as she was taking these top secret documents from Washington, D.C. to New York. She looked like just an ordinary woman with her bulging knitting bag full of yarn and needles.
How about some of the people that she interacted with, and some of the names? One I wanted to ask you about, because I'd never heard this name, was William Remington. I mean, I've never seen any stories about him. That doesn't mean anything. It's just I haven't. Who was he, and how did he get into this picture?
Well, William Remington was one of her, minor spies. He wasn't that important, but he became significant because he was the only person still in government service, federal government service, when she went public with her allegations in 1948. So remember, she defected in 1945. Many of her sources either quit their government work because they knew they had been exposed, or they were forced out by the FBI secretly. So, though she named up to 30 people who were working for the federal government, there was only one who was still employed by the feds in 1948. So there was a spotlight on him, even though he hadn't stolen very significant information at all. He had been an economist at, I believe, the Bureau of Economic Warfare or the War Production Board. So he was unimportant as a spy, but he was important as a symbol. So he was put on trial for perjury and ultimately convicted and sent to prison. So he was the only one of her sources that was sent to prison because of her testimony. And he was killed in prison by other prisoners who were angry at what they saw as a traitor in their midst.
How'd they kill him?
I think they beat him to death.
I saw some video of him denying that he was ever a communist.
Yeah, that's what a lot of her sources did, which is why the issue has been clouded all these years, is they did deny that they were communists, and she had no evidence. She didn't bring any documents with her. I mean, Whittaker Chambers was a similar defector at the same time as she was, an ex-communist who made all these charges. Whittaker Chambers had saved documents to prove his charges. She had nothing. It was just her own testimony, so she was easily discredited.
Why do you think we know so much more about Whittaker Chambers than we do about Elizabeth Bentley?
Well, I think for a variety of reasons. One is that, he, as I say, he had those documents. A very dramatic story, how he saved them, and then he temporarily moved the microfilm to a hollowed out pumpkin, and then he led the House committee investigators out to the middle of his pumpkin patch to show them that the microfilm hidden in the pumpkin. So it was a very dramatic story of an ex-communist, an ex-spy who had secreted away this information that was hard evidence, or apparently hard evidence, of actual espionage by the Soviets back in the 1930s. So not recently, but nevertheless, he had that evidence. Also, Whittaker Chambers was an editor at Time magazine. He was a brilliant writer. And he wrote a very compelling autobiography called Witness that a lot of people still read. It is, very ideological, but it is an important document of the time. He was a heavyweight intellectual. Elizabeth Bentley was not a great writer or an intellectual, and she didn't have the documents.
But the interesting context that you have in your book is that she was the one that testified first, and before a committee, a subcommittee run by Senator Homer Ferguson, who I'd never heard of either.
Yeah.
And he hasn't gotten much attention over the years. The other committee, the Un-American Activities Committee, got a lot of attention. And what's your take on that?
Well, she first went in front of Ferguson's committee by choice, because she thought that committee, the Senate committee, which was red hunting like HUAC was in the House, but the Senate committee was known for being much more careful and sober and rational. And she thought that would be a better venue for her. But then she got subpoenaed by the House Un-American Activities Committee and went and appeared there as well. But yes, I think as I was researching this, I was really struck by the way that her testimony directly led to Chambers' testimony. As she made these allegations, she had no support for it. It was her word against all of these other people. But some of the ideologically sympathetic members of HUAC said, well, how can we support her? Let's find somebody else who has a similar story to show that what she's saying is not outrageous. And so that's why they called Chambers to testify after her, because he had been telling people around Washington for years that he had been a communist member, a secret communist member. He had not said to members of Congress that he was a spy, but he had said that he was a member of the Communist Party, and that many government officials had been as well. So they called him so that he could back up her story about, well, this is how the Communist Party is organized. This is how it infiltrates the federal government.
There's always an argument of what was the first hearing ever televised, but I gather that the HUAC hearing was televised in August, 5th, 1948, something like that. Mm-hmm. And I wonder what if you have personally been able to get a chance to see more of these hearings. You see some of it on YouTube, and we've had some of it at our network. But is there someplace, is it stored away where all that video is?
That I have not been able to find that. I'd be very interested to see if anyone else knows differently, but I have not. No, most of the video that we have is from the newsreel cameras, and I don't think they kept that film very long.
Give us a story about how she would operate, meet her contacts, exchange information, And how was that? How did she set that up? And how much of it was done in New York City?
Well, I don't know about percentages, but a lot was done in New York City and in Washington, D.C. Those were the two places where she operated. Washington was more later, after Golos was unable to travel. She would, when she was first meeting a source, she would either communicate over the telephone or through written notes that were delivered through intermediaries, that they were to meet at a certain diner at a certain time, and she would be carrying a red rose or a copy of this or that magazine. And she would then ask them if they had ever been to Cleveland, or there'd be some sort of code phrase. And they would then realize that they were there to meet each other, and they would sit down and have a cup of coffee and exchange information. After she had set up relationships with these people, of course, the elaborate, I'm carrying a rose and I'll say, how's the weather in Cleveland? They didn't need to do that anymore. But she would usually arrange at each meeting the time of the next meeting. So, next Tuesday at 10 a.m., and let's meet at this different diner. Because they were afraid that the FBI was following them, so they were quite careful. But as near as we can tell from the FBI files, in fact, the FBI was not aware of these activities at all until she came and told them.
Do you have any idea why the FBI did not know about her?
I think that her gender plays into this story in so many interesting ways. As I said, she was able to escape detection because she was this ordinary-looking woman with a knitting bag. I think the FBI was not interested in her. They were following Golos, and so they started following her for a while, and then they stopped. I think they just thought, well, she's just the girlfriend. Why should we waste resources on her? For the same reason, I think the KGB underestimated her. And as I said, they talked about killing her because they thought she was a security risk, but they never got around to it. Because again, they just thought, well, she's just kind of a pathetic woman. Why do we really need to take the time and effort and to kill her? And so they never did. And then, of course, she was underestimated as a defector because people said, oh, that crazy old biddy, she couldn't possibly have been a real spy.
How long did she live?
She lived until 1963, and she was born in 1908. So I guess that would make her 55.
As you were doing your research, did you change your mind in any way about this whole story? Were you surprised at any point?
Well, I would say that my takeaway was both surprise at the extent, the number of people that she had, and the extent to which she had told the truth, but also surprise at how much had been made of it when not that much significant information was stolen. In other words, she was an important spy. She did get a lot of documents. They did help the Soviet Union. All of that, I think, she played an important role in bringing to light. But then her story of these mid-level bureaucrats stealing, airplane production figures during the war helped serve as a basis for, a nationwide panic about communist influence in the White House. And it's really quite a leap from the one to the other.
Who was Helen Tenney?
Helen Tenney was a poor woman, one of her sources, Bentley sources, who was too unimportant to warn. So the Soviets, after Bentley's defection, actually had a much more important spy than Bentley. One of their most important in history was Kim Philby in London, was the head of British counterintelligence for the Soviet Union. So he's in charge of catching Soviet spies, and he was a Soviet spy. And so he's one of the very few people that was briefed on Bentley's defection. The FBI, J. Edgar Hoover, tried very hard to keep her identity secret so that they could run her as a double agent. In fact, Hoover gave her a male code name because, of course, most of the spies were male. So if you called her by a female code name, it would give it away. So he called her Gregory and used masculine pronouns in all of the memos about her, and didn't even tell the president at first who she was. So he kept that information very close, but someone in the FBI, possibly Hoover himself, did tell Philby, and Philby then told the Soviets. So the Soviets were then, within days of her defection, able to tell all of their sources, stop spying, the FBI is watching you. And some of the most important, the actual Soviets on American soil, were then taken back to the Soviet Union. So they were warned, almost all of them, not Helen Tenney. Apparently they forgot. She was very minor. She was a New York heiress who had a few government jobs. The most recent one had been in the OSS, the predecessor of the CIA. So she had stolen some documents for Elizabeth. So she was one of the few people who, when Elizabeth was turned into a double agent, was willing to talk to her and meet with her. But her information was not that significant, and she was a rather unhappy person, and she soon afterwards tried to kill herself and was put in a mental institution. So she was never prosecuted, but she was just an example of one of the many people that Elizabeth had recruited to spy for her. But in her case, unfortunately, she had not been told to stop.
Elizabeth Bentley lived in what kind of an environment in New York City?
Well, she had an apartment. She lived quite well for someone of that era. She had it wasn't like she was motivated by money. She didn't get the huge amounts of money that, say, Soviet spies in the 80s would get, millions of dollars. But what she got was a comfortable salary that enabled her to have a nice apartment, go to spas, go to nice restaurants. She took Caribbean vacations a lot. So that was part of the reason that she started to get depressed after she defected. Is at first the FBI wasn't paying her. Finally, it agreed to start paying her $50 a week. But that was one of her many complaints, is that it had cost her financially to defect.
And why did she go to the New Haven office of the FBI to out herself?
Well, she thought she was in Connecticut at the time, and she thought that the New Haven FBI office would be safer, because she figured that the Soviets were always watching whoever walked into the New York City headquarters of the FBI. So she went to the New Haven office. It was in a warehouse, and so she was able, she thought, to sneak in without anybody noticing, that without anybody watching the building.
And how did they treat her, the FBI?
That's another interesting story, is because they weren't really thinking in terms of trying to catch Soviet spies at the time, especially in the New Haven office. The agent who met with her was quite unimpressed. I mean, to be fair to him, she was not clear. She was sort of on a fishing expedition. She figured if they were about to arrest her, then she would know right away. But this guy had clearly never heard of her. And so she started telling a story about how a man had picked her up in a bar recently, which was true, and then told her that he was a government spy, which was also true. And so she was trying to find out if he actually was. This was just an interesting story that had helped prompt her defection. She had been dating a man that she met in a New York bar, and he ultimately told her that he was a big-time government spy. which panicked her because she thought he was from the FBI and he was there to arrest her. But in fact, he was a curtain salesman from Brooklyn with a wife and 3 kids who just made up stories like that to women he met in bars. So she went to the FBI and said, I've met this guy. He said he's a spy. Is it true? And the New Haven agent then filed a report on impersonation. That's what they thought it was at the time. Oh, this guy is impersonating a spy. They didn't say this woman is a spy because that's not what she had said. But she thought that they had all of these files on her and that, they would soon contact her and follow up. But in fact, it was a couple of months before they started, the New York office started to realize what they had here in her attempt to contact them. So they started phoning her apartment, and finally then she went into the New York office, and that was her real moment of defection when she started her confession.
Short paragraph from your book. As it turned out, she hesitated only briefly. It was ironically enough a fight over money, a fight worthy of most conniving, greedy capitalists that finally convinced Elizabeth to answer the phone and betray her comrades.
Right. Well, she worked for a Soviet front in America. That was the source of her salary, and she was beginning to feel like she was being cheated by her bosses.
What 2 years after you wrote this book, another book came out on her. I have not read it. The last name of the woman who wrote it is Kessler. It's called Clever Girl. Did she write that because you wrote this one, or do you know her?
I don't know her, but we were working on it at the same time, working on our books.
How does stuff like that happen? I run into it all the time.
Well, I think in this case it was, I don't know the other scholar, but I think that we were both struck by the revelations from Venona and the Soviet archives, that suddenly we knew that this woman who had been dismissed and ignored all these years was telling the truth and had been a significant spy, even if she exaggerated some of her stories afterwards.
What was the impact? What has been the impact over these 23 years about this book, your book?
Well, I would hope that I have helped to correct some of the narrative about the emergence of the spy scare. And it started in 1948 and, of course, contributed to the whole Second Red Scare. I think it's important to understand that there were some real spies, that it was not completely made up, that the Soviets were spying in America. However, I think it's also important to then look at how those stories of real espionage were then weaponized by the opponents of the New Deal.
How many days of hearings overall were there about this subject, both in the Senate and the House?
Oh, must be hundreds, because it wasn't just that first year that she came forward. And as you mentioned, there's different committees. There's HUAC, of course, and then there was Senator Ferguson's committee. There was a Senate Internal Security Committee. There was McCarthy's committee. There were so many committees for really through the 50s. It goes up into the early 60s that they were holding all of these hearings.
How often did she testify?
Well, she would often get trotted out to testify because she could always talk about her experiences, even if it wasn't relevant to the particular person that they were grilling at the time.
Who were you able to talk to that had any contact with her when she was alive?
Well, I'd say the interviews that I remember the best were, first of all, her cousin, who was the only person that I knew who could tell me about her early life, because she didn't have siblings and never had children. I talked to a couple of the FBI agents who were extremely helpful. These were people who managed her in the 50s when she was an FBI asset. She was a professional witness and she was being paid by the FBI, but they were extremely frustrated with her for drinking so much. And I also talked to Harvey Matuso, who was another ex-communist, who said he was her boyfriend for a time in the 1950s. He lied a lot, so it was hard to know which part of that conversation I should believe, but he had a lot of good stories.
A couple of other people you write about, the Silver Masters.
Yeah, the Silvermasters were important sources for her. Well, Helen Silvermaster was just the wife of Greg Silvermaster, who was an economist. He had gotten his PhD at Berkeley, was very much an ideological communist who worked for the government, and he turned over documents from the Treasury. But more important, he tried to recruit other agents in the Treasury.
Mary Price.
Mary Price was the secretary to a journalist, a columnist, Walter Lippmann, who was one of the most famous columnists in America at the time. And so she was not a government employee, but she had access to gossip in Lippmann's files. So
and she was a communist.
She appears to have been a communist. Yes. So that's what Elizabeth said, was that she befriended Mary Price so that she could look at Lippmann's files. So again, this isn't classified information, but the Soviets were interested in picking up gossip. And then she became worried. This again is Bentley's story. That the Soviets were going to use Mary Price for what was called a honey trap, to entice American government officials to bed and then manipulate them into giving up secret information. And Bentley did not want this to happen to Price. And so then she started discrediting Price to her Soviet controllers, saying that she was unstable and unreliable, so that they dropped her. Price later denied that any of this happened, but she does appear to have been in some of the sources that were released in the 1990s.
Walter Lippmann was one of those powerful journalists in the world at the time. How did he have a secretary who was a communist and not know about it?
I think that a lot of people did not understand at that time that some of the people that they worked with were communists. It's not, I think even at its peak, the American Communist Party had 100,000 members in a country of over 1 million people. So it was a rather fringe organization. So it's not something that's going to come top of mind when you're interviewing potential secretaries is, are you a communist?
Thanks to you and reading your book, I learned about the Browder family. And there's a number of them still alive. They weren't communists, but they were their great-grandfather, their grandfather, or their well, in this case, they're all gone. The sons of Earl Browder. Who was he? What impact did he have on the country?
Well, Earl Browder was the head of the Communist Party of the USA for a while. He was active in the Popular Front. That's a period when communists decided that instead of excoriating liberals, they were going to work with liberals because of the threat of fascism, particularly from Germany. And so he was in charge of the Communist Party at that point. He was later forced out as the party considered him to be not ideologically pure enough for them.
Went to prison a couple times?
I believe so, yes. I'm sorry, I don't remember that part.
Bill Browder, who has been in the news in the last couple years, do you know that name? The Bill Browder that's connected with the Soviet Union, Russia, and I believe he lives in London.
Oh, no, again, that's one of the names from 20 years ago that I'm afraid I don't remember that much about.
I did see, and again, I thank you for leading me to this. Laura Browder, who is the granddaughter of Earl Browder, is a professor, and she's supposedly, I read this, I haven't talked to her, writing a book about Earl Browder, so I'll get the answers to some of these questions hopefully in the future. Another name for you, by the way, the Mary Price story. Do I remember you saying that Elizabeth Bentley wanted to have a physical relationship with Mary Price?
Yes, so that was what Mary Price said. There was also another one of her sources who said this, another one of her female sources who said this. So since there were the two allegations, it's quite possible that Bentley was bisexual. I don't think she was gay because she clearly had a lot of relationships with men and she loved Golos, but apparently she did make overtures, did flirt with a couple of the women that were her sources.
When did she get out completely of the testifying, the speaking, and anything to do with this story?
That would have been the early 50s. She had trouble. She never really hit her stride as a public lecturer. She got some money from her book, but it wasn't a huge seller, and that ran out after a while. The FBI paid her for a while, but not enough. And so she just started trying to look for other forms of work. She taught at a college in Chicago for a while and then got fired. Then she taught at a high school in Louisiana and got fired. And then she ended up teaching at a reform school in Connecticut. But by the mid-50s, it's interesting looking at the documents, both the FBI and the KGB aren't sure where she is. She just sort of disappears.
There is a name in your book that is well known, at least by people my age, but at the time he was only a Monsignor, Fulton J. Sheen, who became a bishop, of course, and then became a television star. How did he relate to her?
Well, she converted to Catholicism and for a time in her post-communist years, and was very much inspired by Monsignor Sheen.
So, do your students care about this?
I think they do, actually, yes. Well, first of all, it's just a great story. It's a spy story, and it's a story of defection. There's betrayal and assassination attempts, and love and sex, and pressure to turn on friends. Unfortunately, it has a very sad ending for everyone involved.
What did she die of?
She died of, I think it was abdominal cancer, quite possibly exacerbated by her chronic alcoholism.
You wrote a book called The Newspaper Axis,
Mm-hmm.
6 press barons who enabled Hitler. When did you do that book, and what was the point?
So that book was my most recent one. It came out 3 years ago from Yale University Press, and it is on relatively the same era. It's on the interwar era, but it was looking at the U.S. and the U.K. and the most powerful newspaper publishers of that time. And of course, most people got their information from newspapers, and how they advanced their foreign policy beliefs through their newspapers. They were very much against the U.S. Getting involved in the European conflict and then the European war in any way.
Talking about Robert McCormick, who owned the Tribune in Chicago, Lord Beaverbrook from London, Joe and Eleanor Patterson. Who else was on the list?
Harold Rothermere, who owned the Daily Mail, and William Randolph Hearst.
And again, what got you interested in that story?
Well, I got interested. I was interested in Hearst because in my research for a variety of books, I read the Hearst newspapers. The Hearst newspapers were It was the biggest newspaper chain at the time. So if I want to get a sense of what Americans were learning about the news, then the Hearst newspapers are the best source. And I got interested in how Hearst was using his newspapers as a way to influence American opinion. At first, I was interested in the way he used it against the Democrats domestically and liberalism and the New Deal. But I began to feel like that story wasn't inherently surprising. He was a very rich man and he didn't like, taxes and regulations and unions. But I was surprised the extent to which he was a proud, as he called it, America Firster and isolationist, and how he continued to push those ideas even into 1941, very much against Lend-Lease and aid to Britain in the early part of the war before the U.S. joined the war. And then as I got interested in Hearst, I realized that there was a network of publishers who shared similar beliefs. And so I decided to write the book about them collectively. So it was sort of the opposite of my trajectory from the Bentley book, where I started writing about all these American women who spied for the Soviets and ended up focusing on one. I started out with this one just focusing on Hearst and then expanded it out.
Are you writing another book?
I am, yes. It's called Empire of the New Deal. It's about the New Deal in the territories of the United States at the time. It's Puerto Rico, Virgin Islands, Alaska, and Hawaii.
What's the best thing about living in Davis, California?
The people. It's a very friendly town.
Well, the title of this book we've been talking about is Red Spy Queen, biography of Elizabeth Bentley, and our guest has been Professor Kathryn Olmsted at UC Davis. Thank you very much for enlightening us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Thanks for tuning into this week's Booknotes Plus podcast. If you have a moment, please consider rating and reviewing us wherever you listen to podcasts. Your feedback will help others discover the program. And don't forget to share this episode with friends and family. For the latest on new episodes, schedule updates, and more, follow us on X @C-SPAN Radio.